All right, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Find your seat. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and being in person. We really appreciate you making the drive. The weather here in Newport's a little bit crazy and unpredictable, but it's really nice to see all of the folks that are in the room. My name is Cinnamon Moffat. I am the Associate Director of Marine Research Support here at Hatfield in Newport, Oregon. This is actually a hybrid event, so we have folks in the room, we have folks online. I want to thank those folks for joining us online as well. A couple of logistics and a couple of announcements, and then we'll just jump right into it because I'm excited to hear what we've got going on tonight. For folks online, if you have any technical issues, please put those into the chat box. Our volunteer Roseanne will help navigate those with you. If something happens and you can't see or you can't hear, make sure we know that so we don't just keep going and then you aren't able to participate. So communicate with Roseanne, that would be great. And then at the end, if you have any questions for today's presenter, put those into the chat. Roseanne will read those out so that we can all hear it in the room as well. For folks in the room, I see some new faces. I see lots of familiar faces. But because this is a hybrid event, you will need a mic to be able to ask your questions so folks online can hear us as well. All you need to do when we get to question and answer is raise your hand and I'll run around with this mic and we'll make sure that you get a chance to ask those questions for today's speaker. But again, thank you everybody for being here. Much appreciated. I wanted to promote our next Science on Tap. We do these almost every month throughout the academic year. And so our next one is going to be on November 19th. The flyer I have right here has an error in its date, which I just realized, which has given me pause. But we have Trevor Branch, who is going to be talking about the impact of killer whales or orca whales on baleen whales. And it's got a very nice Halloween feel to the flyer with a little bit of fear and blood. So we're very excited to have Trevor come join us next month. So please come back, same place, same time. November 19th. I'm looking at Lisa. That's the right date, right? November 19th. Thank you very much. So that is our next Science on Tap. If you are curious about any of our events, you can go to our website, look under the events page, and information about what's coming up and abilities to be able to see it on site or online is available there. You're also welcome to sign up for our listserv. That's just for seminars and events that are open to the public here at Hatfield. That is a way to get that information directly emailed to you. We don't use that email list for anything else but that. So feel free to sign up for it. But really why we're all here tonight is to listen to Dr. Astrid Leitner. She is an assistant professor of ecological oceanographer at Oregon State University in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, where she's been since 2023. Astrid is broadly interested in biophysical. See, I'm all messed up because the date was wrong. um, that create and sustain aggregation of animals in oceans, especially in the deep sea. She has received her Bachelor's of Science degrees, double, is that correct? Yeah. In 2013 from the University of California, Santa Cruz, one in marine biology and the other in earth and planetary sciences. Astrid then got her PhD in biological oceanography in 2018 from the University of Hawaii, where she focused on communities, deep water topography, and building ecological baselines in deep sea mining regions. She uses a combination of active acoustics, video techniques, and experimental trials to better understand and explore ecosystems in our deep oceans and their connections to humanity. So we are very excited to have you here and share with us. So go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. I think I'm mic'd up, so everybody should be able to hear me. Thank you. All right, so I am noteless right now. We have changed a little bit the setup, so I'm going to try to stay on time, but I'm also without notes. So I'm going to see how this goes. I'm really excited to use this opportunity to talk about deep sea mining. I think it's a really critical issue right about now, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of current events and current developments in the deep sea mining sphere. But like Cinnamon mentioned in my introduction, I've been working in kind of the deep sea mining realm since my PhD, so for over a decade, and mostly working on ecological baselines. So a lot of the regions they're trying to mine we haven't really been to before, scientifically at least. And so we're doing basic kind of monitoring of what's there pre-mining and trying to understand, by making a baseline, what we could potentially impact, what we could potentially lose, and what we have to think about as we maybe develop this new industry. So how many of you have heard of deep sea mining? Online, you can throw thumbs up or reactions. Okay, exactly, right? So almost everybody in the room here is raising their hands, right? It's been in the news. It's been a topic of conversation. And so my goal today is kind of present a broad view of deep sea mining, not only from the biology side, but trying to bring in some of the other relevant spheres as well, so that you all leave this maybe a little bit more informed about this kind of current issue. So deep sea mining is often talked about in relation to this, right? The necessity of us doing an energy transition away from fossil fuels towards renewables, because we have really drastic effects that we're already feeling from climate change, right? Floods and droughts and wildfires, increased intensity of storms, et cetera. And we are armed with this arsenal, right, of renewable energy technology that's continuously being developed. And these are touted as like, this is the answer. We got to switch to offshore wind, land-based wind farms, solar. We got to scale up geothermal, right? We have all these options. Wave energy might be coming online soon, right? A lot of us are driving electric cars now. And so there's this hope, right, that we can just electrify everything, get away from fossil fuels. But there's also a cost to that, right? If we were to transition all of our way of life into kind of the electric sphere, we have to cable everything, right? We have to transport that electricity. And that, for example, requires copper, a lot of it, because we have to connect everything with cables. Also, the building of this infrastructure itself requires a pretty staggering amount of raw materials, especially metals. So I'm not expecting you to read these tables, but these tables list all of the different metals that are going into each of these technologies, right? And a single wind turbine, for example, 150 tons of steel, 5 tons of copper, 3 tons of aluminum, almost a ton or half a ton of rare earth elements, right? So we have to take this into consideration, that the transition to renewables will also come at a cost. Not only do we have to build this infrastructure, right? One thing with renewables is that they are intermittent, right? The wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. And so with renewables, we have an increased need for batteries and energy storage technology. So this is a graph from the World Bank that estimates the expected growth in energy storage demands through 2050. And kind of no matter what projection they use, there's going to be a drastic increase in the next few decades. And with that comes, again, a increased projected demand for metals that we use for batteries. So looking along this list, some of these elements you might recognize, some of them maybe not. Lithium, probably everybody recognizes, right? We all depend on lithium batteries right now. Cobalt is another one that maybe you didn't think about, but is used very, very heavily in battery technologies. Both of these are estimated to have an increase of almost 500% relative to the demand, the 2018 production by 2050. So we're really thinking we're going to need a lot more of these metals in the next coming years. And this is some of the motivation that's driving deep sea mining. And it's not just renewables. Oftentimes, mining companies especially, are saying, we are supporting the transition to renewables. But it's not just renewables, it's all of our technology. Smartphone, 7 billion smartphones on this planet. I didn't know that. I had to look that up for this talk. That's staggering, right? 7 billion smartphones with 1.4 billion produced each year, and that is growing every single year. And in a single smartphone, we have all of these metals again, right? So again, related to, there is an increased demand. And so we are looking for more resources, both on land and underwater. I just wanted to put up a periodic table here to show how many of these elements actually count as critical metals. So So when people are talking about critical minerals, critical metals, these are what they're talking about here. So there's, they occur in different amounts. And so they're color-coded here, kind of from trace to very abundant. And then on the right, you have a map of the major producing countries for the scarce, so these green shaded elements here. And the US is not the biggest dot on this map, right? In fact, the US has actually systematically exported most of its production of these metals overseas because it tends to be a pretty dirty, polluting process. And so we have outsourced that, and that's coming back at us now because we are reliant on imports for a lot of these critical materials that are projected to become more and more critical in the next couple of years. So this kind of layout breeds these geopolitical problems, right? And I am not a politician, I am not a lawyer, I am not a sociologist, right? But we hear about these news stories, and a lot of them actually have critical metals and minerals in the backstory. So in the backdrop of the Ukraine-Russia peace talks negotiated by the US was some sort of weird deal about Ukraine's rare earth minerals. This whole story about us taking over Greenland, right? Buying Greenland. Greenland has a huge deposit of rare earth minerals, right? Right now, China is the kind of dominant producer for a lot of the critical minerals. We actually rely on China for 100% of 12 different critical minerals that we rely on in the US. And so China has power then to turn that spigot of exports off and on, and so is using that as a negotiating tactic, maybe, to deal with this trade war that's going on. So this is already causing geopolitical problems. And so again, this idea of diversifying where we get our critical minerals is pushing us into the deep ocean. There's also an environmental reason. Again, a lot of the mining companies, the deep sea mining companies will say, land-based mining is really damaging. Let's go to the deep sea. It'll be so much better. So they have some sort of a point there, right? This is a copper mine in Utah, in Bigham Canyon. It's humongous. It's about 4 kilometers long across and 1,200 meters deep. And it produces copper, like I said, and it has a track record of polluting groundwater with lead and arsenic. Mining tailings are stored in a dam that periodically leaks and threatens the local communities. It's caused pollution not only in the groundwater, but also in the Great Salt Lake. And this is not unique to this copper mine, right? That's a kind of common problem. So we have this story of damage to habitats, a problem with storing tailings, water contamination threatening human safety. We also have then an environmental justice side. So this is a picture of a cobalt mine from the Democratic Republic of Congo. DRC produces 70% of the cobalt that the world uses. And cobalt, like you might remember from the beginning, is a very critical battery mineral currently. Cobalt mining is super poorly regulated and has had a track record of human rights abuses and kind of violations. And again, we are pushing more and more of our production overseas where there are poorer regulations because we don't want that in our backyard, all the damage, all the environmental repercussions. And so there's also this, like I said, environmental justice issue. So it's sold as, let's go to the deep sea, we won't be doing any of this. I have to say, and I will keep repeating this, that is not a great argument because nobody's talking about shutting down land-based mines. So it's kind of a tactic that they say, well, look how bad that is and we'll be better. It's not an either or. We are scaling up production in all fronts. So we still have to deal with the problems of land-based mining. Those aren't going away. But let's get into what is deep sea mining. So it's the mining of critical minerals and metals from the seafloor. This can happen both in international waters and in domestic waters. And there are 3 main types of deposits. So there's massive sulfide deposits, cobalt-rich crust, and polymetallic nodules. And all of these have kind of a different mineral profile. Massive sulfides occur basically on hydrothermal vents. So we have metal-rich water that comes out of the seafloor at these spreading centers most often, that then precipitate out when they meet the cold seawater and form these chimneys. And these chimneys are then metal-rich, copper, gold, zinc, silver, lead. And they're talking about basically breaking those off and bringing them to the surface. These are also home to very specialized chemosynthetic communities that oftentimes occur nowhere else, not even on other vent systems. So there's a really kind of big extinction risk there, we believe. They're talking about trying to focus mining on inactive vents to try to reduce that, but that's what massive sulfide deposits are about. There's ferro-manganese cobalt-rich crust, which occurs on seamounts. So this is this kind of black crust that you see here. It forms on seamounts specifically because seamounts have increased current speeds that kind of keep the sediment off of the substrate. And so slowly over time, these layers of these minerals can precipitate out and build up into a thick enough crust that it's a worthwhile deposit, rich in cobalt, like the name suggests, but also copper, manganese, platinum, rare earths, among others. So we are talking about grinding these off of the surface of seamounts, which are also very unique habitats, can support some of the longest lived animals on our planet, deep sea corals, sponges, other vulnerable marine ecosystems as well. And then polymetallic nodules, which is probably the deposit that I'm most familiar with and that the kind of realm that I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of the talk. These are kind of pebble to shoe size, sort of round accretions of these polymetallic deposits. Again, copper, nickel, cobalt, manganese, rare earths, among others, found inside. They usually precipitate around some sort of nucleus, like a shark tooth, for example. And these deposits occur on abyssal plains very, very far away from land, where the natural rate of sedimentation is very, very low, which again allows this slow accretion over time. These nodules grow at about 0.5 centimeter per million years. So they're very, very, very slow. By definition, a non-renewable resource. So what will this look like? Let's see if I have to click or go. There we go. So this is a schematic animation done by MIT of what one of these mining operations for polymetallic nodules in this case would look like. They've got this big support ship. They carry these nodule collectors like you see here. And these nodules occur at abyssal depths, so about 5,000 meters deep. So this collector vehicle has to sink for a couple of hours before it even reaches the seafloor. That's how deep the water column is in these regions. It's about 16,400 feet, for those of us who don't think in meters, which is about half the height that a commercial airplane flies. So very, very deep water. Finally, this thing reaches the seafloor, spits out a bunch of sediment. We'll talk about that later because it stirs up the bottom. And then it essentially drives across the seafloor and vacuums up these nodules. It not only picks up nodules, it's also going to pick up the top few centimeters of sediment. So we're still arguing about how much sediment they pick up. But what we have tested, it looks like they pick up about 5 to 10 centimeters of sediment. If anybody works in the deep ocean, that's about how deep the biology goes, 5 to 10 centimeters. So they perfectly pick up all of the relevant fauna in the mud as well. Then this thing is actually dragging behind it a hose that then pumps up to a riser pipe and then pumps the sediment and rock sludge up 5,000 meters to the surface ship, where it is then processed, cleaned, and then offloaded, probably by another support ship so that the mining vehicle can stay out. That's the plan. And this is not theoretical anymore. These have been built, these have been tested, and they're truly enormous, right? You can see the little people there on the side of the screen for scale. And these, so these work. Currently, there's one company, the metals company, which is their current iteration. They've gone bankrupt about 4 times in various places. Now they're called the metals company, TMC, and they are the ones pushing this technology forward for nodule mining. So where might deep sea mining occur? Let's go back out to all of the different types. This is a map of the whole planet. All of the colors are where we want to mine or our mineral deposits. So in blue, we have our polymetallic nodules. In yellow, we have our crust, which is focused on these seamount chains. And in orange, we have these dots of hydrothermal vent deposits. And then the region where this is kind of most advanced is the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is pointed to right there by that arrow in between about Hawaii and Mexico. And currently we have licensed for mining exploration 1.5 million square kilometers of the sea floor. What does that mean? That's about equivalent to 1% of all the land area on Earth. So we have already licensed a very, very large portion of our seafloor. You'll notice also in white are the bands that represent national waters, so the waters that are under the jurisdiction of a specific country. You'll notice that there's deposits both in international waters and in national waters. And these are going to be governed differently. A country can basically do whatever it wants with its deposits federally. Internationally, there's more involvement of the international community there. So let's get into that. Who is involved? Well, so number one, it's actually you and I and everyone on this planet. Legally, international waters are the common heritage of all mankind. So we are all stakeholders, at least in the international problem. Mining companies, of course, they're trying to make money. Individual countries, they're the ones getting claim areas, right? Controlling what's going to happen both in their claim areas in international waters and domestically. And there is a United Nations governing body that is responsible for kind of these licenses in international waters. The International Seabed Authority was established with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which I believe was 1982. And this map here shows all of the member states. So in blue shades are the member states that recognize the authority of the United Nations in deciding what happens to international waters. You'll notice the US is in white. We are not a party to this treaty, and so we do not recognize the authority. And that comes to play in a little bit. So to give you an aerial extent, well, let's talk first about the countries involved. Very, very long list of countries that are already have already paid something to this ISA to get international mining claim areas. Most of those claim areas, as you see, are in the CCZ region between Hawaii and Mexico. All of these little polygons are current mining exploration claims or reserved areas, which are not reserved from mining, but reserved for mining. So for developing nations, there are claims that are reserved for them where they do not have to pay the same amount of money as developed nations to be able to mine and get a license for that from the ISA. Some of these will also have claim areas for the other deposits as well. And again, the US doesn't have this because we don't acknowledge that we need this because we're not party to the treaty that says that there should be any regulation at all. This also is a really good opportunity to drive home kind of the extent of the region that we're talking about, right? The Pacific Ocean, it's big, it's blue, it's kind of hard to get a spatial scale here, but the extent of the CCZ is about equivalent to the extent of the continental United States. So imagine basically vacuuming the surface off of something as large as the continental United States. The good news is that the International Seabed Authority is also tasked with conservation and management. And this was their shot. These blue boxes is a attempt to kind of do an MPA network, a reserve area to try to protect the biodiversity. We've pointed out some problems, like there is no box in the middle. That we did some scientific work and showed that that was indeed a problem. They have actually listened to us, which is great news, and they have now done a new one that's kind of in the gap right in the middle where there are no claim areas. They've also added one in the eastern edge. But there is at least some sort of acknowledgement that we need to try to preserve these areas. And when is this going to happen? Well, we are capable of mining, so anytime now. So 2017, we did our first sulfides test mining, 2020. We did our first crust mining, 2022 was the test of that nodule miner. And right now, because the US has had a new interest in, quote, unleashing America's offshore minerals, there is now, the metals company is trying to circumvent the International Seabed Authority because they're tired of waiting for them to put in mining code and regulations and apply to mine international waters through the US mining code. That's going to happen apparently this year, so we shall see. So let's talk a little bit about the communities that are here. Mining companies, especially when talking about nodule fields, will say that these are barren deserts. There's just these beautiful fields of rocks, and all we have to do is go pick them up. It's very far away from everything. No one will be harmed in the process, et cetera, et cetera. So we have this tendency to think nothing lives in the deep sea until we go and look, and every time we look, we find the spectacular life that lives there. This is a montage from ROV footage that we got from the Western CCZ of just the megafauna, the large animals that we saw. And when we go to these places, we continuously make new discoveries. So half of the species, half of the megafaunal species that we collected on this cruise were new to science. This is megafauna, right? We're talking about big animals. And that's also not even really where the biodiversity in the system lies. The biodiversity of this system is mostly within the small infaunal community that we can't see in this video that live in the top sediments, which are also going to be removed. But so oftentimes you'll hear mining folks talk about, you know, the biomass in a square foot of the seafloor of a nodule region is so low, almost nothing lives there. Well, it's low because a lot of what lives there is small, right? But if you compare the biodiversity of that same square foot or square meter, it's similar to a tropical rainforest on land, right? So we're talking about a really highly biodiverse region. And again, that biodiversity is not even fully quantified yet. So fortunately, we've got a lot of research going on now before mining starts, which is great. We're a little bit ahead of the game with this industry. We tend to be responsive rather than proactive. This time around, we're doing research before things are happening, which is great. We're busy, us working on these baselines, creating these species inventories, who lives there, trying to understand the community structure, the diversity, but also trying to understand the biogeography. So how are these communities connected to what we know from the greater Pacific? How are different communities from different mining claim areas connected, unique or similar? What are the kind of baseline standard environmental conditions? Who's eating who? How does carbon flow through the system? What kind of ecosystem services are being provided, right? We know that the deep sea floor is really critical for long-term carbon sequestration, for nutrient cycling, for nutrient regeneration, for feeding those bottom waters, and all of which we get back around in the ocean conveyor belt and get up when we have upwelling, for example, here off our coast, right? So we know there's already some very important ecosystem services, but we're trying to quantify more and more of that. And my role has really been to focus on the predators and scavengers that live in the region. This is a collage from one of our papers that shows the diversity of these large top predators. And top predators are not the most abundant in an ecosystem, but they are very, very important. They can control their prey, the abundances of their prey populations, have all kinds of kind of downward trophic effects. And they're also great indicator species. So we want to know kind of what the prior to mining conditions are of these animals, and monitor them for any kind of impacts. So we're talking about large fishes. These are, you know, multiple feet long, up to meters. We're talking about very large crustaceans. We're talking about octopus. We're talking about urchins, brittle stars, everything you see on this collage. And we study these mainly through a variety of imaging technologies, but top predators are really sensitive and highly mobile, so they get out of the way a lot. So you drive around a giant school bus in the deep ocean, you have all the lights on, they're gonna probably get out of the way before you get to see most of them. And so what we do is we actually use baited cameras and baited traps to bring them to us. So what that looks like is we take very expensive cameras and throw them in the ocean and hope they come back. We tie basically bait onto the front in our field of view. We let that fall through the water column, reach the bottom, and then we wait to see who shows up. So this is, for example, a Basozetus. It's a cusk eel. They are lurkers. They actually don't come to the bait directly. They feed on the amphipod crustaceans that come and scavenge on carcasses in the deep ocean. You also have these rat tail fishes that are very, very active, tear at bait, very ferocious scavengers and predators. And this is kind of how we get some of these inventories. So my research interest, is, as Cinnamon was saying, lies in how the shape of the seafloor influences deep ocean communities. And so we have deployed our camera systems all across the CCZ. We've looked at plain habitats, we've looked at abyssal hills, we've looked at abyssal seamounts. And what we have noticed is that topography is very, very important. This region is not this homogeneous plain desert, right? It's actually a mosaic of habitats, and each habitat is unique. So this is kind of the video that I love to play to demonstrate that really clearly. We have on the left a shot from an abyssal plain, on the right a shot from a seamount, and we have dramatically different communities. Actually, this aggregation of eels was something we've never seen anywhere else in the abyssal ocean. We're actually trying to do more research to understand how this many predators actually can exist at these densities. Of course, we've attracted them from kind of a radius, but we're still trying to figure that out, something we've never seen anywhere else in the deep ocean. But generally what we find is that topography is important, and where we have elevations in topography, we tend to find different animals, bigger animals, and more species. We also have discovered lots of nodule-dependent fauna. This is not from our baited surveys, but from our visual surveys. You've got these very long, dramatic anemones with tentacles that stream out over meters. We've got xenophyophores, which are single-celled organisms that create these big structures that almost look like corals. We've got actual corals and sponges. And then we've got megafauna that don't directly depend on the nodules themselves, but animals like this octopus, for example, will use sponge stalks that are anchored on nodules to brood their eggs. We've also got animals like this little polychaete here that actually makes their home in the nodules themselves, right? So lots of animals, lots of the diversity of these habitats are also intrinsically linked to the actual nodules themselves. The other thing that we've been finding is the more we look, the more heterogeneity there is across scales. So location really matters and has a big influence. So this is a single picture from a single piece of the seafloor, and we transition from sediment to nodules to paved, basically basalt or crust. So there are really fine scale differences, and each of these kind of habitats have different communities. On the order of kind of tens of kilometers, we see that seamounts and plains very different even when we're only 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers apart. On the scale of a mining claim area, we compare a couple different bordering mining claim areas. Each one has distinct communities. If we zoom out even further, the CCZ, in comparison to kind of other places we've sampled with similar technologies in the Pacific, is very unique, and the CCZ itself comes out not in one region, but in two. And so all this to say, location matters, scale matters, and we have to take into account all of these different scales when we try to manage and protect these habitats. So we found all these cool things, these cool critters, and we are looking in a place that will probably be seeing lots of impacts. And so people immediately ask, well, what about recovery? What's our recovery options look like? We obviously have never done commercial scale deep sea mining, so that's a little bit hard to get at. But this is a plow track that scientists did in 1989, not in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, but in Discal, which are in the Peru nodule province to the south. And they tried to simulate mining by basically literally dragging a plow across the seafloor, and then they went and revisited a couple months, couple years later, and most recently 26 years later, which is when this picture was taken. So 26 years later, you can still find the track, and it looks almost exactly like it looked the day it was done. So we did some work to look at the disturbance versus not. 26 years later, we still found significantly fewer of the dominant fish species in the plowed areas versus on the sides. This is the dominant fish species. You can ask me more about that. We also find that megafauna are altered. Suspension feeders, like corals and sponges, still at lower densities 26 years later. But maybe even more concerning, microbial communities are still impacted 26 years later. So microbial densities are still lower within the plow tracks, and carbon cycling in what we call the microbial loop is still depressed by about 1/3 26 years later. So the recovery timescales are going to be long, and that is for the animals that can recover, right? Because the animals that are dependent on the nodules cannot recover because their nodules are gone and they're not coming back. So we've talked about kind of direct impacts of mining, direct mortality, habitat loss, community changes, right? There's also another flavor, and that is the indirect responses. And that's because we have a sediment plume to deal with, which can then spread out over larger areas and cause burial clogging, et cetera. And so this key is that the seafloor is not going to be the only thing that's affected. There's also going to be effects on the water column. So this is kind of the picture that people paint of deep sea mining. The reality is that there's a whole lot of water between the surface and the bottom at 5,000 meters. And possibly the most concerning is that currently mining companies are planning on releasing mining effluent, mining discharge, somewhere in the midwater, about a quarter of the way down. This means that there will be a dewatering plume that's going to be really, really rich in lots of these metals. We're also concerned about noise from these giant riser pipes, and these will have impacts in this totally different system. And I think all of us can kind of relate to this idea of plumes traveling much, much further than the kind of direct area of impact. We've all lived through wildfires. We've all looked at air quality, right? This is a picture from 2021 where you see the fires kind of on the West Coast affecting the rest of the United States in terms of air quality. And so we're thinking that we're going to be seeing similar things in the water column. And we do rely on the deep pelagic for lots of different ecosystem services. Vertical migration, for example, right? These animals are moving up and down. They're feeding at night in the surface layer, bringing that carbon down to the depths with them during the day. These animals are also provisioning lots of our offshore commercial fisheries stocks, so deep feeding billfishes, for example, and tunas. So all of these can be affected. The deep animals themselves, how will they be affected? We have some ideas, but research is pretty limited in this area still. We're just starting some of that now. What we do know is that an estimated 3/4 of the animals that live between the surface and the seafloor use light, their own generated light, bioluminescence, for functions that are critical to their survival. Escaping predators, finding and getting prey, reproduction, communication, right? All the things that are required for you as a species, as a population to survive, they use light. So what happens when we dump sediment into what are the clearest waters in the world, right? The animals that rely on light, these functions will be threatened, they will be impeded. So these are theoretical thoughts. We wrote a paper of what all the potential midwater impacts could be, but we haven't had a lot of research because we haven't had a lot of need to see what happens when we dump a bunch of sediment in the pelagic ocean. Now we do. So we've gotten a seed grant from the Galkey Center for Marine Innovation and Technology to develop a tank system that's going to be able to actually do some of these exposure trials on pelagic animals to get the first measurements, right? To inform regulations about the concentrations of what is acceptable to be dumping and at what rate, and when we can expect to affect negative impacts on some of these animals. So this is Lauren Owelling. She was a undergraduate intern with the Innovation Lab here at Hatfield, and she and the engineers on the project, Drummond from the iLab, Megan Wengrove, designed a tank system. We're at kind of prototype 2 now that you see here on the slide, to be able to maintain these turbidities in a circular flow tank system that can keep things like jellies and other pelagic animals alive over long periods of time while monitoring kind of all of our environmental conditions. So soon we will be able to kind of run the first controlled biotrials. Caroline Edmonds here in the crowd. She's a new grad student. I don't have a picture of her yet, right? So I'll put a jelly there for now. But say hi to her. She just got here and she's going to run some of these paired trials hopefully next summer when we have at least 2 of these tank systems. So we can have 1 control and 1 experiment. And that'll hopefully be enough impetus for us to actually get a full grant to be able to do kind of more extensive trials with with other animals. This is kind of what that tank system looks like in action. We're dumping sediment in here. What we're looking for in these tests, we're testing for the physical effects of the sediment particles, right? We've got a whole size range that these animals are going to be exposed to, from very, very fine clays, which stay in suspension for a very long time. Actually, the thought is maybe they'll stay in suspension indefinitely and just kind of spread out in an intermediate nephloid layer that will slowly expand across the Pacific Ocean. That's because they are in suspension. They'll remain neutrally buoyant. And there's also coarser sediment, like basically sand-sized particles that come from the nodules being shook up over 5 kilometers of riser pipe. This is a picture of a jelly that was decided that they would try to eat some sand, basically. And what's happening is they can no longer maintain buoyancy because they're trying to eat the sediment that's then pulling them down. They don't know that it's inorganic. They're not used to being rained on by shrapnel. So yeah, negative effects there. I just wanted to show this as a picture. This is 0.1 grams per liter. That's how turbid that water is. What's coming out of the riser pipe from the tests has been 13 grams per liter. So 100 times more turbid than that is what we're thinking about. It's basically a sludge. The other thing we want to do is we want to test for cumulative effects. So not only are we dealing with the sediment, we're also dealing with the metals. So there's a metal cocktail that's joining the sediments. And there's also, surprisingly, a huge load of microplastics. So again, analysis of some test mining effluent has shown 1 order of magnitude higher microplastics concentration in the effluent samples versus what we see in the deep sea floor. So that's great. Another thing that we have to try to test for and control in our experiments. What we've done so far is they've done some testing on just the aqueous solution, so removing all the sediments, just clear water, but that has been exposed to this like metal-rich concentrations. And we've seen that in about 25% of these effluent samples, we've had reduced survival and growth of kind of the standard marine lab rats, which are like marine rotifers, larvae of kind of estuary fish. We don't usually test on pelagic animals, right? Which is why the tank system is necessary. But we are seeing just the metal toxicity by itself without any of the sediment is also having some concerning effects. So what we're worried about here is individual issues: respiratory distress, auditory distress, reduced feeding, reduced visual communication, buoyancy problems, metal toxicity, scaling up to the population level where we find changes in community composition, emigration for those animals that can, mortality for those that cannot, or decreased fitness or reproduction. And then that scaling up to impacting services that we rely on, right? So whether that's fisheries, possible contamination with metals of our seafood, right? Lots of our tuna that we eat comes from the Central Pacific, actually. There was a great paper that looked at the overlap of fisheries and mining. Carbon transport, biodiversity, right? So we're thinking about all of these things, and we have to remember to try to scale that up, right? We're talking about large-scale, long-term effects, all the way from the water, all the way through the water column, all the way to the seafloor. So as we come to the end here, where we find ourselves is a place where we have to think about the pros and the cons in all of these different spheres at the same time, in addition to the unknowns, right? Because there's still a lot of unknowns. So what is acceptable risk? What is acceptable harm? What is non-acceptable harm? What does it mean to have sustainable development, right? What are we allowed to do in the goal of sustainability, right? And we have to think about the economics. We have to think about the environment. We have to think about the social impacts, the human impacts, right? And it's not trivial. It's not cut and dry. But we are at a point where we can make those decisions. It has not happened yet, so that's good. And I wanted to end on a kind of upbeat note. People will sell this to you as it has to happen, it's inevitable, it's going to happen, we're on train tracks and there's nowhere else to go. There's a big pushback from global conservation groups, but there's also economic pushback. If you are interested, you can watch the House committee hearing on deep sea mining. It's fantastic. Actually, our representative from Oregon is on that committee, and she talks about the economic argument of like, wait, didn't you guys go bankrupt 4 times? Are you sure this is going to be feasible, right? So other than that, there's some economic arguments, but there's also technology that's coming up that might make this whole argument moot, right? We can develop new technologies for batteries that aren't so dependent on the most trace metals we have on our planet, right? That exists. We know about salt batteries. There's a huge push right now for sodium-ion batteries, trying to commercialize those. Even Tesla right now runs on a lithium iron phosphate battery that has no cobalt, no nickel, right? And they're running, they're going. The sad news is that the most recent plan announced in 2025 is to basically use a nodule to power a Tesla. So the new batteries are supposed to have, guess what? Nickel, manganese, and cobalt, literally a nodule. But what we know is it's totally feasible to make batteries that function without these deep sea metals. We also need to talk about repairability and durability. Note I don't put recycling up there. We can talk about that. Recycling is kind of a mess for these metals, but we don't need to make our technology disposable, right? So we can lower the material demands by changing not only how we produce things, but also how we consume things. And then we can't get around fixing our land-based mining problems, right? Again, deep sea mining is not going to replace land-based mining. That is a logical fallacy that's often pushed by mining companies. It's not going to happen. It's in addition to if it happens. So we can't get around, we need to fix land-based mining, and there's actually lots of research, including at OSU, about how we can mine more efficiently with less contamination on land. So I want to leave you with those thoughts, and thank you for listening. And on an upbeat note, let's watch this video again, and we can take some questions. Thanks, you guys.
I'm going to guess we have some questions for you. So we're going to bounce back and forth between folks online and folks in the room. Roseanne, do we have any questions online yet? All right, folks online, go ahead and put those into the chat box now, and we'll work through these, and then we'll work on the questions in the room, and we'll start with John.
That was an excellent presentation, very polished. Thank you. The scales of these minerals, and is there any picture of how much is there, how much we're going to be using if everything doesn't change and that kind of thing? If we're mining the deep sea, are we talking about something that's produced in millions and millions of years and obviously is not renewable? And are we going to be run out of it in 5 years, even if we do this? That kind of thing, that kind of question is like the scale of all of this, all of these things that demands some dimensions on it. Is there any, I mean, maybe it's not there.
Yeah, well, the mining companies certainly try to make those projections. Those are numbers that I don't have off the top of my head. I know that there was a study for like a crust mining, for example. If they mine an entire seamount, this was in Japan where they did the crust mining, they could, I think, fulfill Japan's cobalt needs for 10 years or something. And the animals that you destroy live over hundreds of years, right? So the ore grade is not necessarily better in these deep sea minerals versus on land, but you don't have to dig through a bunch of non-rock that you don't like to get at it. So that's one argument. It's just kind of more efficient to get at. But then you have to drive out into the middle of the ocean. I don't know. The economics seem a little sketchy to me, but again, I'm not an economist. But yeah, it's not like we're just going to solve our problems by scooping up a bucket, right? This is going to be decades worth of mining over very, very long spatial scales. We're talking about mining, well, just even to mine an entire mining claim area will take decades. So they're talking about operations 24/7 for more than a decade. Yeah.
All right, I think we have other questions in the room.
Politics, politics, politics. So it's out of sight, out of mind. We've got
Yes.
Pebble Mine that they fought for just for the Bristol Bay sockeye salmon. We've got mountaintop removal, 20 tons of ore to get 1 ounce of gold. So it's just a place that, how do you teach this class when we're in a time of oligarchs and this incredible fascism when it comes to economics? Screw the economists, they're wrong all the time.
Well, I mean, the economists are arguing about it, right? They're not saying, there's not one kind of agreement in the economy world that this is a feasible thing, that this will even pay off. I mean, anybody who's worked offshore has had, what happens to their operation when a storm blows through? What are you going to do with a 5,000 kilometer long or 5,000 meter long riser pipe? What do you do with the ship? What happens when your nodule collector vehicle has a problem? How often does an ROV have a problem? All the time, right? And these are much more complicated machines than that. So the economics, and then transiting back and forth from the CCZ to like even San Diego or Hawaii, if that's where they're going to be processing this ore, right? That the amount of fuel, just the cost of doing that. So I think the way you get at oligarchs and the way you get at the people is with the economics. And that's not my job. But we have people making those arguments. And I think they're strong arguments. And we see that by the companies repeatedly going bankrupt. So TMC, the CEO of TMC, has been a CEO of various mining operations before that, which all went bankrupt. So maybe the economics will solve the problem. Maybe, I don't know.
All right, we've got a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Okay, the other problem is that nodules are distributed very heterogeneously.
Yes.
Cost is very high, so there's the possibility that the companies are mining their investors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and I tried to touch on this a little bit in the talk. The heterogeneity of the seafloor is actually phenomenal. In that one picture, right, you get from no nodules to complete pavement, and then something that they can't mine with one of those things, which is just crust, right? The nodule collector is literally a vacuum. So if you vacuum hard wood, you're not going to get any wood, right? It's not a grinding machine. And that is interesting. We recently did an expedition, the Nautilus Ocean Exploration did a mission to the Cook Islands, and there was actually, it was still very heterogeneous, but there were spots where, I mean, there were entire dives that were basically just nodule pavement for a long time. So I think there's specific regions, but yeah, I mean, one of the big things is how do we prospect in the deep ocean efficiently? Because you fly, you fly a tiny little ROV for 24 hours, you're going half a knot, you're not going to get very far in these really huge regions. And so I don't know what their plan is. They are trying to develop technologies. There are calls right now for funding from DOE to try to develop these prospecting models. Like, can you invent a technology that allows me to scan the seafloor at a rate of, kilometers and kilometers per hour that will tell me how many nodules are down there? And we don't have that technology yet right now. So the thing is, prospecting on land for mines is actually also very difficult. So the mining company is not adverse, or mining industry is not adverse to that risk. It's kind of built in. Prospecting is very, very inefficient. So I don't know that that's necessarily enough to dissuade people that are in the investing in mining game, but it's certainly a problem. Yeah.
Other questions in the room? Okay, give me just a second. As folks in the room can see me running around, but folks online don't know why I'm like clunk, clunk, clunk. Hang on.
Thanks, Astrid.
Hi.
Hi. I want to ask you about something that I know is near and dear to your heart, and that is I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the critters that we've been seeing in some of these awesome photos and videos. Like, what proportion of these animals have been identified for a long time? Are they, you mentioned that some of them are long-lived. I want to know more about how they scatter and gather on the marine, on the benthos and all that kind of stuff. Can you tell us a little bit more about some general trends of the critters that you see?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Yeah, so, well, we had this expedition to the Western CCZ. Like I said, half the animals that we collected were new to science entirely. When we were in the Eastern CCZ, we discovered, I think, more than 2 or 3 new families, and I think 1 or 2 orders as well. These were the megafauna people. This wasn't directly my work, but I was on those expeditions. So, I mean, like, orders taxonomically is like a very, like, there are branches of life, of the tree of life, that we didn't even know about, right, that we're discovering there. Also, what we're finding is just a huge amount of rare species or singletons. So, like, in a box core where you take, you know, a half a meter of sediment out of the seafloor and you sieve all the animals out of the mud, for example, and you identify them, you have a huge amount of singletons and very, very rare species. This is actually horrifying for statisticians, right? If you have a lot of ones, that means the rest of your community matrix is at zeros. It does a mess for all of us scientists. But it's actually really interesting, right? It's like, how can there be so many singletons? How much of that is just sampling, right? But if you take a bunch of box cores all right next to each other, you will still find singletons in those. So we don't quite understand, I think, how the diversity is maintained over those scales. That's something that was pretty surprising to us when we started working in the CCZ, and we continue to see that 10 years in. Just this really, and we see that also in the fishes. In the fishes, it's a better argument that, like, well, I mean, they swam away and you didn't see them that time, right? But we see animals that are very regionally specific. The kind of thought a priori was, well, everything is kind of just roaming along because it's just one giant abyssal plain and things are just kind of randomly moving along the sea floor and they don't gather. They are just basically randomly scattered doing their thing. Things like our observation of this aggregation of eels really speaks against that. Like, maybe that is a life strategy for example, rat-tail fishes, which we know a little bit more about, but doesn't seem necessarily to be the case for things that are more regionally specific. So we have some cusk eels that we, for example, only see on the western side of the CCZ and we never see on the eastern side. These eels we only saw on seamounts. We never saw, not a single one, 1 kilometer away from a seamount. Right? So there's a lot of specificity and there's a lot of habitat partitioning and niche partitioning that I don't know why this is with the deep ocean. This comes back to, like, the azoic hypothesis. Like, we think everything is dark, it's the same, and there's probably nothing there. Is like kind of every time we go deeper in the ocean, that's the thing we come to. Right now, that's the conversation about the bathypelagic. So we've done a lot of research now in the last 5 to 10 years about the mesopelagic. 200 to about 1,000 meters. And then we're like, everything stops at 1,000 meters. There's probably nothing down there, right? There's very, very few papers that have done quantitative sampling of the bathypelagic. And yet when they do, right, they find endemics that only live in the bathypelagic. They find ones that actually connect to the overlying water. There's so much we don't know about, for example, the bathypelagic, right? And yet the mining companies argue, well, okay, we see your point about vertical migration and fisheries, and that's probably not great. So we'll just dump right at 1,000 meters and then we'll be fine. Right? And so it's like, okay, great. Well, then let's do 5 to 10 years of research on the bathypelagic and then we'll show you that that is also going to be a problem, right? And so the argument with at least the midwater dumping is, well, why don't you put it back to where you got it from? You already messed up the seafloor. There's already a benthic plume. Like, can we do some very basic things to make the damage less? Can we reduce harm? And they're like, no, that seems too difficult. So then what we need is a governing body, a regulation that demands that, for example, right? Or that says you can't dump more than X amount of sediment, whatever it is. So you have to invent a technology that brings up less sediment with your rock. You don't want the sediment. Why are you bringing it up? Why are you paying to pump mud to the surface just to dump it back down? Why can't we invent a technology, a mining technology that doesn't have that problem, right? There's ways to get kind of around that. I got on a soapbox again and stopped talking about animals for a little bit. But yeah, so singletons is a kind of a big thing. This kind of aggregation behavior that we didn't suspect actually happened. And in the bathypelagic, for example, we don't really know any of that. So yeah, TBD. I'd like to stand here in 5 to 10 years after we get this bathypelagic grant funded, hopefully, and tell you all about what happens in the bathypelagic and why dumping sediment in the bathypelagic is a bad idea. Any other questions?
I'm going to ask a question then.
Yeah.
So can you come up with density with your targeted bait? Do you know the range that you are attracting from this environment?
That's a great question. And yes, we always try to, and that is always models that have uncertainty in them. Basically, since people started doing that, that was the immediate question. Like, okay, here we found a lot, here we found a little. What does that mean? How do we convert it to like a density of what I would see if I drove a camera across the bottom or dragged a net or something like that, right? Because those are, we get those kinds of densities from our other types of sampling. What you do is you try to calculate the swimming speed of the animals, which you can do if you have a stereo camera and you can basically track the animal through time, so you have at least a small view of how fast they swim. So you can do that sort of. You have to know how fast your bait plume is spreading out, so you need to know what the currents are. In the deep ocean, that's often tidal, and so it's actually not too hard to try to get a sense of, you know, how the bait plume might be wafting. You can get increasingly complicated with that, though, with like turbulent mixing and diffusion, and but you can kind of do some calculations to try to figure that out, yes, and you can try to get at a density. The estimations, I feel like people don't necessarily trust, right? How good are our swimming speeds? How do we know what the animals are doing when they're not tracking bait? Like, yeah, so there's a lot of uncertainties involved, and what we tend to do is the baited community tries to just standardize their methodology so we can actually compare. You know, I saw a max of 15 here, you saw a max of 10 here, so we think there's more here than there. So we do more of a relative abundance than an absolute abundance, but we do try to get at absolute abundances. But it's kind of, yeah, it's not great.
Nice. All right. Believe it or not, we are at time. So I want to hand the mic back to you and say, is there anything you want to wrap up with? Anything you want to tell us? Anything you want to challenge our brains with as we drive away on this Friday?
I think I would challenge you to think about not only the areas that are impacted, but the volumes that are impacted, right? I think from land-based mining, we think about area and footprint. In the ocean is three-dimensional, so we have to think of volume. And the volume, if you think the area is staggering, the volume is just astronomical, right? So that's kind of, I want to leave you with that idea of we have to steward our oceans because they're connected, and they're this huge volume that might be out of sight, out of mind, but they're connected. And so what we do in the CCZ is going to have repercussions over the entire Pacific, and it's going to have repercussions over the entire global ocean eventually, and to our whole planetary cycle. So we have to think about what is acceptable harm. And what kind of trade-offs are we willing to do to get to our final goal, which is sustainable technology and development. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Drive safely on your way home. Hope to see you next month.
Yeah. I think so too. I have to do it after. Oh, let me turn this off.